time, we'll open our meeting with agenda item 1.1. Roll call.
Mr. Alexander? Not in attendance. Mr. Ruckus is excused. Dr. Coker is excused. Mr. Corley?
Here.
Mr. DeVilliers?
Here.
Dr. Fountain?
Here.
Dr. Gorey is excused. Dr. Gray?
Here.
Mr. Javia?
Here.
Mr. Jenkins? Not in attendance. Dr. Joffrion?
Here.
Mr. Jones?
Here.
Dr. Joseph?
Here.
Ms. Laviolette? Here. Dr. Lewis? Not in attendance. Mr. Narcisse?
Here.
Dr. Ortley?
Here.
Mr. Powell?
Present.
Ms. Tanner? Not in attendance. Mr. Watts?
Here.
And Mr. Williams?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Agenda item 1.2, recognition of guests. At this time, we'd like to recognize our best members present, Ms. Roche, Mr. Morris. Thank you for being here today. Are there any best members who I have failed to acknowledge? Any legislators who are present with us today? And again, welcome to all of our guests. Agenda item 2.1, approval of the minutes from our November 29, 2021 meeting. You should have a copy of the minutes before you. I move. Motion to approve the minutes by Superintendent DeVilliers.
Second.
Second by Superintendent Javia. All in favor, aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. At this time, there is a request for a change to our current agenda. Ms. Davis, would you like to speak?
Yes, so I would need a motion. The department has requested to move item 5.1 to the end of the agenda, which would be changing it to item 5.4. So if I could get a motion to do that.
So moved.
Mr. Worley, second.
Second.
Mr. Williams, anyone opposed to that? Thank you.
Agenda item 3.1, consideration of an update regarding the proposed minimum foundation program, MFP, FY22 formula. Do I have a motion to receive?
So moved. Second.
Motion made by Superintendent Watts.
Second.
Second by Superintendent Gray. Dr. Brumman?
Thanks, Mr. Jones. I believe I saw Ms. Ciano stepping up. Yeah, there we go. First of all, thank you all for being here. I understand some individuals may still be stuck in traffic. Traffic is pretty brutal out there today, according to one of you in the room. Just want to acknowledge all the hard work that you all have done, my appreciation for that. It's good to see your faces in this building. We've been under a mask mandate for some time, so it's good that we're in a position with the virus where that is not the case, so it's good to see everyone here today. We do have a very heavy agenda today. I'm not apologetic just because there's a lot of business that has to be done, just making you aware that it is a heavy agenda today. And we'll start with Ms. Ciano, who's going to make some remarks relative to MFP, which has been considered by the MFP Task Force, will be considered by Bessie in March, and then we'll go to the legislature with whatever Bessie pushes forward. So, Ms. Ciano.
Good morning. So I just wanted to review with you right now what the MFP Task Force has recommended to Bessie. That will be presented to Bessie in our March agenda. The Task Force met a few weeks ago and outlined the following. The first thing was that they agreed to maintain the base per pupil amount at the 4,015 amount. So there would be no change to the base per pupil. They also recommended that within the governor's executive budget, he's presented funding in MFP that would allow for a raise for certificated and non-certificated staff. That would be for $1,500 for the certificated staff and $750 for the non-certificated, inclusive of any retirement contributions, as has been the case in the past. And that would be tied to the most recent contribution rates as advertised by the retirement systems. The next thing they recommended was expanding the Career Development Fund allocation. Right now, there is a very narrow description of what is allowed to be used to pay for the Career Development Fund. It should be expanded to include the words course tuition, and that would expand the use of the dollars in case there were systems in the future that wanted to take advantage and have their students enroll at a local career technical college system like a dual enrollment course for CTE courses. So that was also endorsed by the task force. The next thing was the supplemental course allocation. This is the money that's provided for those courses that are beyond the normal school day. And right now, there's a $59 per student allocation provided for in the resolution, and they recommended that that be increased by $11 to $70 per student. So there would be a slight increase in cost associated with that, but it would increase that per pupil allotment that is currently provided. Those allocations are made on the number of students that you have in your school systems, so that's why it's tied to a per pupil amount. The next thing was that it was presented that there should be some compensation for these certificated mentor teachers. They are supporting both undergraduate candidates as well as post-baccalaureate candidates to earn their teaching certificates. Those were employed across the state, and the task force recommended that we add something new to the formula in level 4, that it be a stipend for these individuals of $2,000 on an annual basis. And that would be both if you're a mentor teacher for a post-bac candidate as well as for an undergraduate candidate. So that would be a slight increase as well. And then the next thing was that they definitely endorsed, the commissioner presented that day and talked about the budget, and that there could be a recognition of some additional revenue by the state through the revenue estimating conference in the spring, later in the spring. And so the task force recommended that Bessie include in their transmittal memo, which is the cover letter to the formula when they send it over by March 15th, that there be a language in there asking that if additional funds were recognized, that the formula be returned to the Bessie, and so that they could reconsider the incorporation of additional funds for a pay raise, and that the pay raise be raised to $2,000 for the certificated staff and up to $1,000 for the non-certificated support personnel. So that's something that would be incorporated as in the memo that covers the transmittal. That concludes the recommendations made by the task force. I can answer any questions you may have.
Any questions or comments by council members? Superintendent Johnson?
Ms. CEO, regarding the potential pay raise, is that going to include those who are teaching preschool, pre-K3, and pre-K4, or are these salary increases only earmarked for K through 12 educators?
Because it is within the MFP, it can only be earmarked for K through 12 educators.
So I just think that that's something for people to be aware of. It's very difficult to not, or to single out a group of educators in your system and not provide them the increase that others are getting. And so that will fall upon the district's shoulders to come up with those additional funds to ensure that we're incentivizing all of our employees.
Questions or comments by any other council members? Superintendent Powell?
Thank you, President. Yeah, on the stipend, the $2,000 stipend for the certified mentor teacher, that the only personnel that are going to qualify for that stipend is if they would meet the state certification requirements to be a mentor under the program.
Yes, there is criteria set forth that sets the parameters for that, yes.
Questions or comments from any other council members?
Yeah.
We do have public comment
I do want to
cards.
point out to that we have waived those certification requirements for mentors, so that might be something for this year because of COVID. So that might be something we want to think about. I don't know. Or you want to?
Yeah, there was a work group that spent some time looking at what could qualify someone for a mentor, and that qualification, that set of qualifications has been expanded. So for instance, more people are now going to be able to be qualified to be a mentor. So I think it's been a while, but I think some things that were added include like individuals who have principal certification. I think if they're maybe TAP certified or PATH certified, I think those are some of the things that were added to allow for more individuals to serve as mentors.
And can I ask a question?
Yes.
Okay, the mentor stipend though, for a person to receive it, not only do they have to be a certified mentor, but don't they also actually have to have a mentee for that period of time? So it's not just people who have attained that certification who have to actively, so it'll be year to year. And the other question I wanted to ask, we are going to put the stipend and write the language in the MFP that every October 1st will be according to that pepper pool.
That's
Right.
correct. It will be based
It will
on
be
data.
based on your membership each year. So.
Yes, it will be adjusted. We do anticipate some increases, so that language there allows it to grow. There's no boundaries with regards to that. It will be based on account each year.
And could you just give an indication of the amount of money we're talking about for each of these?
Yes, the pay raise itself, the both certificated and non-certificated support pay raise right now is estimated to be about $148 million. If you look at the executive budget, that's how much the governor's placed in there. The increase for the per pupil from the supplemental course, well, the certificated mentor teacher is going to be a little less than $2 million. I'm firming up some counts right now, probably around $1.8, $1.9 million. And then the supplemental course allocation will be a little over $2 million, I think. Let me check that for you, but I can get that for you. The course allocation, the CDF, we don't anticipate that having an immediate increase in cost. We do understand that as patterns of students change and they take advantage of some of these courses, the cost will increase. In the past, we've had about a 15% increase in cost in CDF. That has held true for the last few years, so we do anticipate that could go up, but it will likely not be next year. It might be the year after that.
But this change doesn't increase the cost. The increased cost would be associated with more kids taking those courses.
Right, it is driven by the number of.
It's just what we can do with the money that's changing.
Correct, yes. Yes, and it could drive costs in the future, but we don't anticipate that being immediately. Sorry, my laptop just disconnected. I'll get that number for you. It's a couple $1 million, around a couple $1 million for supplemental course.
We do have public comment cards for any member of the public today who would like to make comments. Please come up, grab one and fill it out. Are there any other questions or comments by council members? We have a comment request by Michael Falk representing Glass. Falk?
Yeah. Beth, the supplemental allocation on the pay raise, that's going to be in level 4?
When you speak of, you're talking about the pay raise?
Yes.
Yes, the pay raise is going to be in level 4, just like the other prior two pay raises, the one from 1920 and the one from 21-22.
And that provides more stability for the districts, because prior to that, used to be based on your base enrollment, so if your enrollment went down, you didn't get the money to sustain that. And then on the CDF funds, it doesn't increase the fund, but it allows greater flexibility for districts, because you had many districts that had carryovers for years because it was so restricted. And I believe that's it. Thank you.
Any other public comments? At this time, we have a motion on the floor for the second to receive. All in favor, aye? Aye. Those opposed, nay. Next agenda item, 4.1, consideration of an update report regarding K-12 accountability policy. Have a motion received.
So moved.
Motion by Superintendent Corley,
Second.
second by Superintendent Orton. Superintendent Brown.
Yes, sir, Mr. Jones. As we all know, the last couple of years, not only have we had to deal with accountability during the midst of the pandemic, but we've also been trying to think about accountability policies beyond the pandemic. And so we have spent almost 2 years now with the Accountability Commission, with this group, going over information, going over potential shifts. At this point, there is a group of BESI members assigned and tasked with the opportunity to review data, review best practices, look to what the future might be. And so that group is presently meeting, and those meetings have since most recently become open to the public. But what we wanted to do is allow Thomas Lambert, Assistant Superintendent with Accountability Assessment Analytics, to just run through that with you all in terms of an update here this morning.
Thanks, Dr. Brumley. I think that accurately captures it. You all know that in August, the board put forward a motion that essentially created a K-8 study group around growth. In October, that was expanded to actually include the entirety of the K-12 accountability system, from the idea of should we have K-2 in accountability and how should growth be measured, and looking at the overall consideration of how K-8s are measured in high schools. Since then, we began meeting. Most recently, the meeting was February 21st. The next meeting will be April 1st, and we'll publicly notice it. It'll happen here at the Claiborne building. We're still finalizing the time on that meeting. Happy to answer any questions about that. The intention is still to bring forward recommendations from the administration and that work group in the June BESI meeting cycle. Happy to answer any questions from the council.
Any questions or comments from council members? Superintendent Orton.
I'm not sure if this would go here, but so how does the Accountability Commission correlate their purpose with the purpose of this particular BESI group? Is there still communication back and forth between the two? Can you just kind of give a general overview of that and what those priorities are or purpose of each?
Of course. So the meetings are televised, so anybody that wants, or they're streamed, so you can watch the last one that we had. In that meeting, we shared our engagement strategy and plan. One of the groups that we will engage with in the next month is the Accountability Commission specifically. At the last Accountability Commission meeting, we actually gave them a very similar set of slides. We didn't have the same amount of time that we've had to go through this with the work group, but we went through a very similar set of slides and data with that commission, and we will continue to do that. And as the ideas start to get a little bit more concrete, if you watch that work group meeting, we've been spending a lot of time going through the background of how does the formula work, why does it work the way that it works, and what are some potential ways that we could improve it. And we're getting to a place now where they've sent the administration in a direction around our values in the accountability system, and the places where we see some areas for improvement, and we intend to come back with simulations to share with that group, and we'll also engage with the commission, as well as members of this council.
Deeper into the background, so we want to get more information. So we're definitely not going to act on that after the board.
Understood. Thank you. If I could just make one other, and I heard you say, Ms. Thomas, that you're going to engage with superintendents. So certainly, LAS is also very interested in engaging with this group and with you relative to what these recommendations are.
Absolutely, and Mr. Falk and I have talked, he has my contact info, and he's going to be setting up time to get together and chat.
Questions or comments from any other council members?
So do you feel confident that you'll be able to come up with the whole new structure in 3 months?
I'm confident that we can address the concerns that have been put on the table by June.
So that means that you have some type of framework or some kind of structure to be able to do that in 3 months?
Yes. We have a set of
Share that
values.
with us?
Absolutely. So we have a set of values around the purpose of accountability that we shared with the work group and chatted about it ad nauseum last week. We believe that the accountability system has a couple purposes. One of those is to motivate and to incentivize improvements in student achievement. We think that it needs to be achievable and attainable for that to happen. So that's one thing that we're looking at very closely, particularly in the way that we measure growth and the way that we reward student assessment. We also think that it needs to be a fair assessment, so it needs to communicate things very specifically. It also needs to help us focus interventions and supports where it needs to be. So we know that there are areas where the accountability system either is not completely accurate. You can look at our assessment index and you can see that some schools are doing a really good job. Their progress index doesn't match that. The progress index is significantly higher than the assessment index. You also see in the high school formula, we have 2 indicators for graduation outcomes. The first one is graduation index, which is a pretty pure measure of did students graduate on time. Then we have a measure that is the strength of diploma index, which is a measure of strength that really is a measure of did students attain a diploma. So we're centering in on 2 things. We're centering in on the way that we measure student growth, the way that we reward schools that truly have exemplary growth and move their students toward academic proficiency. And then secondly, looking at high schools and how we're measuring the long-term life outcomes for young people in high schools. And those 2 things, I personally believe, are things that study group, having spent a lot of time with it, this administration spending a lot of time looking at the data, looking at our credentials and making sure that we're appropriately assigning points. Right now, a school receives 100 points in the strength of diploma index for a 4-year graduate. That's not a measure of strength, that's a measure of the diploma. So if we look at those 2 things, strength of diploma and we look at the overall growth index, we can do that in 3 months. And we've been working on it since December, talking with Bessie about it since June of last year. Well, actually, I got here in July. They've been talking to Bessie about it for a lot longer than that. So there's been a lot of good thinking and work done in the past. Does that answer your question, Dr. Joseph?
Well, who was involved in the conversations when you said it started back in December? Was anybody on this panel involved in that discussion?
The work group began meeting.
Dr. Joseph, what is your question specifically?
That would, so what exactly are you wanting to change with the growth, and what exactly do you want to change with the grad rate and the strength of diploma?
Yeah. Oh, I
And are
think
you
that's
going to look at any other components within it?
Of course, we're looking at the entire system. One thing that I can tell you for sure that we want to address is the negative growth. If you go back and negative growth is incentivized and rewarded in step 2 of the current growth model. It's a thing that you can go and look at the last meeting that we had. We presented some data on it. You sent us an email a while ago asking for data to be sent to the commission. I thought it was important to share that with both the study group and you all. We gave them a very short version of that. I've got more data to share with you, but it is significant. It is a large number of students, so that's one thing that we want to look at very closely. The second thing we want to look at growth is not all growth is valued equally within the current growth formula. So the longer distance a student has to mastery, a student who's scoring unsatisfactory has a step 1 growth target that is significantly larger than a student who's at basic. A student who's at basic might have a growth target of 5. A student who's at unsatisfactory might have a growth target of 20. So a school that has a lot of students who enter at an unsatisfactory achievement level after their first year, they have to move that student 20 scale score points every single year in order to get points in step 1 of the accountability formula. So that's one area.
We're going to be losing, I've been trying to break in, we're going to be losing, restarting the sound system and the overhead, whatever you call it, over there, what you used to call it. But anyway, it'll be back up in a minute. We're having some sound issues next door there.
Oh, so should we pause?
No, I think we can do, just keep on.
Okay. I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so some schools have to work significantly harder than other schools to get points in step one. That's an area that we talked about with the work group, and I think there was fairly broad alignment around this idea that, you know, growth should be measured and growth should be fair and it should be attainable for educators. And there is a significant difference between giving a kid 20 scale score points and 5. And right now, somebody who needs to move a kid 20 scale score points and moves them 18 could get a 0 in step 1, but a school that moves a kid 5 points, and that's their target, gets 150. So there are very specific and concrete things that we can do, and I think we can absolutely do that in 3 months and be a fair, objective measure that is both, that is a clear communication to the public about the way that the schools are moving students, as well as something that's easy for educators to understand, which we think are 2 key components of the growth measure and improving it. Does that answer the question?
Thomas, I know about conversation about growth and the high school piece of it. I see the note on here about still including the early literacy component in here. Can you just kind of give us an update? I have not watched the meeting the other day, so just kind of where is that in the overall game plan?
So we hope to address that after we complete the work on the growth index and the high school. We think it's a lot easier to look at modeling when you're looking at the current formula as it exists, how we might adjust that formula, and then talk more about the K through 2 proposal and how we would weave that into the accountability system in the long run. But that is still anticipated as an area that we will study as a group, and then ultimately the law requires that K2 be in the accountability system in some way, so we will have to address that in the long run.
So one final question, and maybe for Dr. Crumley, when do we anticipate as superintendents who, I mean, obviously we have a stake in how the accountability measures play out, when do we anticipate seeing a proposed change to Bessie that would be approved that would impact all of us as far as how school and district reporting is released?
I'm happy to take that. Yeah. We anticipate that going to Bessie in June. We anticipate that we'll have simulations at the next, Bessie, is this back on? Great. So I can stop yelling. The Bessie work group at the next meeting will bring some simulations. I anticipate that they will have feedback and thoughts and adjustments, that will be televised. You'll be able to see that. So you can one, get input that way. 2, we're very easy to reach. Shoot us an email, we'll get back with you. And we'll be engaging with this group individually with folks just to see what people's thoughts are as we go along. And then ultimately, we would anticipate bringing it back to SAC to discuss.
So the anticipation is that we'll be opening the 2022-2023 school year with potentially a new accountability formula. Or adjusted.
It's possible, yes.
There's time for the notice to go through. I thought we said we would do the next one.
It's possible. I don't think that it is likely, but it is possible.
Well, I guess so my question is, as far as administration's stand, what do you hope, like is your hope that we're starting in the upcoming school year, or to get something passed that would impact, to Shannon's point, for the 2023-2024 school year?
My hope is that when we arrive at a place where we have a good proposal, we can determine how quickly it will take districts and schools and systems to react to it, and then make a good decision around timeline for implementation based off how significant the changes are. I know that's probably not a super satisfying answer, but if we do wind up in a place where it's a significant change to the way that we look at schools and measure them, then it will take longer for school systems to react, and I would imagine that there would be a longer runway. However, if it is smaller changes, I think that it would be much faster. But also that would be at the discretion of the board.
Again, if there are any members of the public who'd like to make comments, please fill out a card. Superintendent.
So I was looking through some of the documents, and I think there was a correlation made that with, elementary schools are K-8 schools in particular, where the number of schools that were not performing as well as opposed to high schools where approximately 70% were scoring very well, right? And so is it the hope of this commission, the study group, whomever, which way are we going? We're moving the K-8s up, or we're trying to align more the the high schools down? Or we're trying to find a sweet spot in between?
Yeah, I think that the overall position of the work group is we want a fair and accurate assessment of the school. So I would start there, right? Like that's a very important value that everyone on that group shares. And I think that if you listen to the work group, there were varying opinions on how you solve that problem, how you solve that challenge. If you believe that growth is being undervalued, right, and we are growing kids, and then we wind up with an accurate growth measure, and it shows that our K-8s are growing kids, then you would imagine that K-8 scores would go up. You would also think that if you are currently awarding schools for just graduating a student and they're getting 100 points, if they get less than that, unless they are doing more than just graduating a student, their scores are going to come down a little bit. So I think that it is to be seen what that's actually going to play out like, because we have not arrived at the place where we've determined what that growth measure looks like and how it's going to finally play out.
And the second part to that question is, so with high schools in particular, is the study group taking into account that, each community is a little bit different in terms of what they can provide? So whereas in a more metropolitan community, EBR or Lafayette or someone a little bit larger, they have more resources, whereas you have a more rural community where they don't have as many resources to provide those extras, are those things being taken into account as well?
Can you give me an example in the current high school formula where you would say that rural districts should have a lower bar in measurement?
Not saying they have a lower bar, it just happens in terms of providing more course offerings to get those extra points that you're talking about. Because you kind of talked about just having, 100 points for graduation, but to get to 110 points, 150 points, I may not have the ability to get somebody with an associate degree. Or to be getting dual enrollments, AP courses. I don't have the instructors to be able to do those things, or I have a limited amount to be able to do that. So I'm just asking, how is that being taken into account in that discussion?
I'd love to engage with you more on what you would say would be what would be equivalent to an associate's degree, and that a rural school district could provide just as easily, but it would need to be, in my mind, equivalent in terms of like quality of life outcomes for the young person. So I'm happy to engage with you.
I'm just weighing in on that as well. From a rural district perspective, we're able to provide some AP and dual enrollment opportunities at some of our schools, and then some we're able to do virtually. What is almost impossible to deliver virtually are those level 2, those advanced IBCs, those certifications that require, welding or electrical. That's, you can't do that online. So a lot of those opportunities escape us in more rural communities versus in the more metropolitan area like Mr. Jenkins is referring to. So I don't know what kind of sliding scale might be appropriate there, if any, but it is a little bit of a challenge when we talk about strength of diploma and those advanced level certifications.
Yeah, I think a lot about ways that superintendents and districts can work together to kind of leverage resources so that regardless of whether a student's from a rural community or an urban community can have access to the same types of experiences. Or if we know that that experience isn't going to be possible, how do we find an experience that can be done there that is going to get the same good life outcome for that young person, whether they live in a rural community or an urban community? And I think there are a lot of ways to work together to maybe each school district can't have an electrical or welding program, but maybe 5 within 15 or 20 mile radius of each other can have one, right? And then one decides they're going to do a plumbing type credential, right? And they're over here, the electrical one's over here, and maybe students are having to go 30 minutes on a bus in order to get to it, but it is a really, really good life outcome for them. Working across parish lines to make those things happen for every kid in the state. Just an idea.
Yeah, I'll make a note of that. Some of our kids ride far more than 30 minutes just to get to their home school, not making that as an excuse, but geographically, some of my friends in the north districts face, and the districts that have far greater challenges than I do, or our system does, that the accountability system doesn't take that into consideration at all. don't know that if it can, but just wanted that to be noted.
Thanks.
Thank you, Superintendent Jenkins, Superintendent Core, Superintendent Orr.
I want to go back to the high school piece. In your discussions with the work group, y'all talked about what are we truly looking at as far as our graduates? Well, certifications and industry-based certifications to me directly correlate to opportunities for students. We still base ACT, right, and LEAP 2025 on specifically what? What is the purpose of looking specifically at ACT and LEAP 2025 as determining how successful a high school is? Could you articulate that?
Absolutely. One, ACT is the measure by which this state determines how young people access funds to go to college. So like I think that starts and ends that argument pretty easily. And then you can engage in a debate about like the veracity of that assessment and whether it's actually predictive of good long-term outcomes in college. You can have that debate, and I'm willing to have that with individuals for hours and hours on end. We do it upstairs on the 4th floor all the time. So that's ACT. It's how young people access funds in the state to go to college. And then secondly, LEAP 2025, we believe is a good objective measure of whether young people have access and gotten English and math skills. It works in our K-8s, and we know that it is an assessment that we can look at and say how proficient are young people in ELA and math, for sure. It's highly correlated with NAEP performance, which if you believe the NAEP is a good assessment, then you should believe that the LEAP is a similarly good tool to measure that. And we believe that young people need English language and math proficiency in order to lead fulfilling and engaged life in civic and career in college.
And I don't disagree. I guess one thing we've all discussed as superintendents, repeatedly, I'm sure many of the same discussions, the indirect correlation between LEAP 2025 and ACT. We use two different standards to measure our kids. And when you ask business and industry, you ask parents, you ask students, what are the most successful indicators of student success after high school? I'll tell you what, I got a 17 on the ACT. And look where we are. How many have a 25 or higher on the ACT? Just in this room. And the only reason I'll point that, it wasn't right on there. But I'll point that out because recent studies show there is not more of a substantial correlation between ACT and college readiness. And we want to say that's the standard, but when you ask business industry, you ask global companies what they want in their kids, it's the soft skills and the competencies that we continue to develop that are not measured in our accountability system. Most recent studies, 2021, 2020, show there's more of a correlation between GPA than ACT, 5 times greater correlation to success in college than ACT. And I understand where we are because we are restrained based on our accountability system, but until we as a state start to truly look at accountability in different ways, and I understand we have these parameters that we have to operate under, but there are other states looking at other opportunities to truly judge how we're saying how successful our kids can be, and it's not by an ACT, and it's not by LEAP 2025. So I understand the position we're in. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but we do not have the conversation of what are we truly trying to say makes our kids most successful. The academia is certainly a part of it, but I think most importantly, regardless of the stakeholder group you talk to, they say over and over, it's perseverance, the ability to overcome challenges. It's many of the things we deal with on a daily basis. That's what makes kids successful. Not LEAP 2025 and not ACT. I just wanted to say that because
I was listening intently, so give me a second to get my thoughts.
Sure.
The ACT, one, is the way in which we determine how young people get access to funds to go to college. And for young people living in poverty, that is a significant way that they get to better life outcomes is through access to those things. And one way that you don't want to do that is through racking up debt, one. Two, while studies have been done for years, right? Like Chicago's study on ACT was a long time ago, right? Like this is not new research on the correlation between ACT. There's been consistent research over time, but it's not new. And of course, colleges and universities are looking at ways to not use that as a measure. But how would you, right? And we can spend a lot of time on this, and maybe that's accountability system 3.0, right? As we look at this the next time, how do you measure those soft skills? And how do you do it in an objective way? Because you could say, okay, GPA is what's most correlated, the grittiness, right? What would happen if you included GPA as the measure in the accountability system? What would you hypothesize as a guess would happen?
Well, I mean, the common response is going to be inflated in schools.
Right, so the inflation of scores would happen, and then what would happen with the predictability of GPA on long-term life outcomes for young people and going to college and being successful?
But is that not what we're doing? We are preparing kids for a small set of skills for a test to say that that's, I don't want to argue.
Sure.
I just wanted to state that because these are discussions to me when we're in work groups, when we talk to superintendents that we need to focus on. It's not, you're absolutely right. I want to make sure our kids have access to money. That's why I'm pushing ACT. But do I feel that that's truly going to make that kid successful? No, I don't. So.
Thomas, you bring up that, but let's talk about K-2. We're going to include an observation measure. What do you hypothesize is going to happen to teacher evaluation scores? Potentially. So the same argument you bring up to Dr. Artland's point, we can bring up in the K-2 piece that we're also considering.
Right, we can include, you could include a measure to, one, K-2 always from the beginning included a third-party observation replacement scoring system inside of it. We have long-term success in doing that in the early childhood side of class. So there is that, and we anticipate including that. And second, monitoring each teacher's individual, right, like grading practices in classrooms would be a much larger undertaking, particularly in high school. Whenever you put something in an accountability system, there are going to be incentives, right? But we want to make sure that where possible, we have a really objective measure, right, of what is happening. With K-2 observations, we have a consistent rubric that like one observer can walk in and do it, another observer can walk in and do it, and they should get a very similar outcome.
Not a consistent measure yet. We're just in the piloting phase of class and NIET. So let's not skip over that piece. And then let's also not skip over the fact that in a very small district, I've seen third-party evaluators' scores get placed out when teachers have had to basically advocate for themselves with the P-Card Center and get another evaluator to come in and receive a different score that was higher than the third party. So I just want to be very clear that the argument you're trying to make to Dr. Artland's point could be argued with other measures that we're considering.
Yeah, and if your perspective is that we can't get to a place where the K-2 class observation is a reliable measure, and if we can't make it a reliable measure that we feel like won't be inflated, then we won't include it, and it'll just be a literacy indicator. We can do all of those things, but I think that is a much longer term conversation. And that's why we're not addressing that right now in our K-2 study or in our K-12 study and work group. We're looking at the overall formula from really 3rd to 12, and then we're going to really dig into K-2 as we get more data. That's going to take time to build.
And back to Dr. Joseph's point, this is going to be rolled out in June for us to begin potentially in August when school starts.
Thomas, look, I'm new to this position, so I'm learning every day. But you know, when I think about ACT, and you're right, it is the gold standard. The legislature has determined that, and that's what it is. But if League 2025 was truly prepping our kids for ACT, then I wouldn't have to spend the money that we all spend to prep our students for ACT. We go above and beyond as districts to prep and to prepare our kids and give them every advantage to take the ACT, anything that we can help them with. So if League 2025 was truly preparing our kids for the ACT, we wouldn't have to set aside the money that we're using right now to prep them. So, you know, as a high school principal for 7 years and administrator there for 14, you know, I see all groups of students that come in. So I just don't feel like we're measuring the same thing, and I'm not trying to be confrontational. I'm just, as a principal, as a teacher, as a former math teacher, you know, I see it. ACT is the same ACT, unfortunately, we took as kids. And education looks a lot different right now than it did when I was a kid. A lot different. So I just want to make that point.
My response to that would be that I would agree 100% with your statement if 100% of kids were at proficiency on their algebra and geometry assessment. If half your kids are not proficient on geometry and algebra, then we would expect them not to perform very well on the ACT, right? Because The ACT is overwhelmingly measuring algebra, geometry, some pre-calculus trig skills, but like, if your students are, half of them, not getting to mastery on those assessments, that's not an indication of a problem with the measurement, that's an indication of a challenge with the preparation for said assessment, which could or could not be aligned. Though Dr. Brumley has been working with the teaching and learning team and the assessment team on how do we get to a place where our standards are aligned, that we know that ACT, that what we're teaching in our classrooms matches with what students are going to be assessed on the ACT. So there is work to do there, but that's not a reason to throw the assessment instrument out.
No, I understand. I was just trying to make the point, just alignment in testing the exact same, what we're, the end result, we're trying to get to the end result. So we need to be moving our kids from the first testing grade possible all the way till 11th grade when they take it. That should all be aligned. So I'm just trying to make that point. That's all. Thank you.
We hear it.
I'll put on you, Joe, ahead, Frank, if you don't mind. And first of all, Thomas, you're doing a great job. I know you wasn't planning for all of this. Back and forth. It was just a little 4-bullet report.
Every time my phone rings, I go, oh God, this is going to be 25 minutes long, so it's okay.
I do want to piggyback on what Frank is saying, because I think
Jeff,
we look at accountability.
Mr. Powell, I would acknowledge that Thomas probably is over a 25 on his ACT. I'm with it. I mean, not in the over 25 category. The assumption or presumption, and I know there's a lot of psychometrics that go into the evaluation of our Legal 25 assessment. So, but when we start talking about really analyzing this growth piece, which there does seem to be, and I'm in that corner, there seems to be a lot of questions around what growth is measuring. But when you're literally taking completely different assessments from one year to the next on completely different content from one year to the next, and trying to assign a growth number to that, I just think whenever the dust settles with all this, there's going to need to be some very clear understanding of exactly how we're expecting this. We can argue back and forth about ACT or the instruments that are available through those types of assessments, but the biggest question I think that many of our teachers have, our parents have, we have, is the alignment of assessments from one year to the next that we're now associating a growth calculation to that doesn't seem to be expressing what we all think it should be within the formula. If we're experiencing this much growth, then we should see an increase in actual student achievement. We're not seeing that. So I think we're there, but I think the argument you're going to get from a lot of teachers, educators, honestly from students, is the misalignment of assessments, and then we're going to try to attack a growth piece, and if it's hidden somewhere in the mathematical side of this thing that nobody fully comprehends what is the connection between. So you don't have to give a response to that. I just think in all of the conversation, there's going to have to be an understanding that we can stand up in front of our parents, in front of our communities, in front of our teachers, who, their evaluations are tied to this, obviously our boards who evaluate us, that it's understandable. And right now, I don't think anybody can do that in a way that makes sense. And I know, Gary,
and we know that math might be the case, but I know that I hope Dr. Brumley's committee will definitely figure out, and they might already know it, that the ELA standards are definitely different on LEAP than they are on the ACT. And teachers have expressed that, and it's unfortunate that they have to kind of prepare them for both, but they are different in ELA.
Yeah, and I would also say that when you look at the college and career readiness standards around ACT versus math, ACT, by putting out what those numbers are, might even be suggesting that their English test is not as correlated with success, because they say an 18, right, is college and career ready on English. Why is that, right? It's only measuring these fine skills around grammar, punctuation, like mechanics of language, which is different than what the English assessment is doing. Like, absolutely, we'll totally agree. Our English assessment is more the reading and the English section of the ACT. So like, while the two things are not measuring the exact same thing, the math is very close to measuring very, very similar things, right? You have things that kids need in order to be ready for college, right? For pre-cal, all of those things, but you also have base geometry and algebra skills that are being assessed in there. So each subtest is a different question than the test overall, and it is what we have, right? Until we wind up in a place where we have good measures that are reliable, that actually correlate with good life outcomes for young people, right? This is what we have, and it's also correlated or completely exactly the thing that our state uses to determine whether a kid gets money to go to college. So like, until we come up with a better answer than that, we have assessments that are done nationwide, that have been being done for many, many years, that we can look to adjust our curricula and our standards and our teaching practices to make sure more young people get money for college, or we can talk about throwing up the thermometer because we have a fever. And I don't think that we want to do that. I think we want to look at how do we get our assessment and accountability system better in the long run, and in the short run, make sure that we are measuring things that we know are good for young people in the long run.
Comments from any other council members?
I just have just a couple of more things and I'll be done. So the accountability system, the overhaul started in 2018, right? We're in 2022. We've had 2 years of COVID. We haven't seen the full implementation of this new accountability system. That's one thing. My next thing is, and I may be wrong with this, but you know, I don't see how you can make any changes with growth if you don't make any changes with the static side of the accountability system, right? So when you look at, so if I'm correct, you're saying that how can a school have an A in growth but an F be an F? Okay. So on the status side, if I'm a kid and I got unsatisfactory and I move up and I grow to approaching basic, I'm still going to receive a zeros, F. But on the growth side, I met my growth target, if not surpassed it. So I'm an A on my growth, which is only 25%. So if you look at that as on a school level, I can have growth and also still be an F because you set up the accountability system to make it that way. Where I'm gonna get a 0. 5 achievement levels, only 3 of them you can get points. So I can grow and still have a 0 on the status. So it's like you can't put you have the two separate, but when you talk about this negative growth, that's when you want to put it all together. You can't do that. You're either gonna have to, if you're gonna change growth, you're gonna have to go back and look at how you structure the status side of this thing, which is worth 75% of the SDS.
Yeah,
Well, let me back up. 5% for interest and opportunities, 5% for DCI, if you have a school with 7th and 8th grade in it. So really, what, 65%? But it's still the majority of your school performance scores based on status. And if you look at the points awarded for each category and the achievement levels, and you also look at the point differentiation between all of the categories and every one of those sections, you're gonna have to address those things before you address 12.5% of growth at the high school level and 25% growth for 3rd through 8th.
Yeah, if you go back and spend some time and watch the 2 work groups, I actually go through this in detail with them. And one of the issues that I point out is exactly that you can have a perfect growth score. The chair of this group was actually at the meeting. And you can have perfect growth, you can be at approaching basic, and the highest score that elementary school can earn, depending on all the configuration things, right, is between a 37.5 and a 39. Is that something that we're comfortable with? I think that the work group was like, this doesn't feel right. And that's something we're gonna model, but it doesn't have to be by giving points on the status side. You could weight those students heavier in the growth piece, and then result in that student having a higher score. There are a lot of different ways to do it, but what we are looking at is our growth mechanism working, and what are schools getting as a result of truly moving kids? But I literally presented that exact argument without getting into do we give points for students at less than basic. I think that's a conversation of a way to get to it, but we have to agree on this question of if a school moves a kid, if the school moves a kid a lot, should they get like an F in the formula for that student?
You will if you don't change the status side.
You don't have to, because you can weight the growth much more heavily for that student. You can include that student multiple times in the growth measure, and then offset that achievement without actually giving points to schools that aren't moving kids that have them on an approaching basis.
But there's always a flip side for that too.
I'm happy to talk more with you about it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it as well.
But all of this, and you're saying this is going to be done by June.
One just last comment is just, I like telling stories, right? But it's gonna be short, right? As an old coach, I always used to say preseason is the most important part of the season. Preparation, preparing, being ready for the season, right? And June is pretty quick before the season starts. And I need to know what the rules are and be able to articulate it to my assistant coaches, to my team, so that they understand how to react when the game starts, when the bullet starts flying. And that's a quick reaction time for everyone to really understand and be able to articulate to community members, board members at the lowest level, right? And so I think it's critically important that, when we're having a conversation and when we're at the table, we are able to articulate that information as well as you can, right? Because knowing it is great, you can articulate it great, but at the end of the day, we all have to be able to articulate it to a lot of different people. The second thing is that, whatever is going to be the outcome, whether it's June or later, we've had a lot of changes over the last 10 years or more, right? And I think that sometimes we just have to figure out what are the rules, and let's figure out what's going to be something that's going to be impactful for an extended period of time. We can't continue to keep changing and changing and changing and changing. Listen, everybody in here wants to be an A school district. Everyone. Everyone wants children to be successful, whatever that means, right? Whatever those outcomes are. And I think we all agree on that. But we need to understand what the rules are and for them to be in place long enough for us to be able to figure out what we're doing well, what we're not doing so well, and how we can adjust. Because as soon as we adjust and start doing really well, someone laughed at me. I'll close. They're like, you always keep saying you were a B, Mr. Jenkins, you want a B, you're a C. I was like, yes, I was. They just changed the rules. I got to 85B, the rules changed, then I became a C. So sometimes we just have to be able to figure out so that we can celebrate with our communities, or when those things change, they understand why and the hows. And most people don't understand that. They didn't see A, B, C, D, and if you're an F, they see it very clearly, and they make judgments on us, on our communities, not necessarily the schools or us personally, because we come and go, right? But our communities still have to deal with those letter grades, that scarlet letter, right? And so that's what my ask is.
Yeah, I agree. We should have a really good rollout plan, but I think that in addition to scarlet letters, right, you have schools that might be labeled as an A or a B that we might not agree are an A or a B. And I think that is a place where it can be a scarlet letter, but it can also be a false sense of security about how well a school is preparing their young person for the next thing. And I think that's a thing that we all need to grapple with and spend time with, because 87% of schools are an A or a B for growth, which may indicate that we are growing young people. Like, that may be what we come out of this study group with. We may say the growth measure is fine. That could be an outcome. We could also say that it's directionally right. It's not precise. We want to increase the precision. But ultimately, we want to measure our young people moving from where they are to proficiency by the time they move on to the next thing. And in high schools, are we preparing them for the next thing? Are we preparing them for college or career? Are they ready?
Yeah. And just keep in mind, before there was accountability or before there were letters of praise given, we all did pretty good, even the 17s, right? And so we all did pretty well. And we all took different paths, and the kids took different paths. So we have to just be careful how we label things, because one thing I always like to say is that it does have economic impacts to our communities. And so it's very important that we take into all of those things, to account those things.
So one comment, and feels like we're wrapping up, hopefully. I want to speak to the timeline. The motion that was passed at Bessie in October that created the Bessie group to study growth said that that group would come back no later than August 2022 with recommendations. And so in December, when that group was expanded from 3 members to 5 members and expanded beyond just growth, but to look at the totality of the system, the same time frame remains in place. So whenever we're talking about August or June, it is action of the board that has already set the timeline, and so that's why we are working along that timeline. So much work, as Mr. Lambert has said, has already been done. Like we've spent 2 years looking at many of these things. I believe he's been asked to come back to the group for their April meeting and bring some simulations around some different themes. So there are unknowns at this point that have to be worked through. And Mr. Jenkins, around communication, I remember 5-6 years ago, however long it was, this group, myself included, spent considerable time and even allocated a resource to make sure, Mr. Falk, you were a part of this, making sure that whenever that shift happened, that we could adequately communicate to our communities the shifts that did happen. So like Mr. Lambert said, an important piece will be rollout, not just in communication, not just from the state, but also within your local community.
As Mr. Lambert said earlier, I was part of Monday's meeting. I hope we all can agree that this conversation is welcome and needed. I'd like to be intentional in thanking Mr. Lambert for all the work he's done in taking a deep dive into the accountability data. Would also like to mention the members of Bessie's work group and their willingness to lead this work. Members Morris Jones, Mellerin, Davis, Morris, and Holloway. We do have one of the Bessie work group members here with us today, Mr. Morris. I'd like to refer to him and give him an opportunity to speak. Mr. Morris.
Yeah, I just had a couple of comments. One, really, as a member of that work group, really appreciate the dialogue this morning. Your input is most welcome, most appreciated, and it's obviously an integral part of the process. Just a couple of comments on 2 things that didn't hear a whole lot of discussion about. I think it's Mr. Jenkins, if that's correct. You did speak a little bit to it, but I think there's 2 common threads that I heard a lot of interest from every member of the work group, and that is simplicity and transparency. So I think you'll hear a lot more discussion about that, an interest to make it more simple. I don't think it can get more complex, right? So I think there's a lot of interest in the work group to simplify the process, and then obviously transparency, so that whenever a teacher looks at his or her work and they look at the assessment, then they're comfortable that the value they're adding to the system has been recognized and is appreciated. And if we don't get down to that level, I don't think we're adding a lot of value. Thank you for your comments today.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Superintendent Narcisse.
Yeah, just one question I had. Thank you. Sorry about that. Low voice. Is the direction of the department is to provide more points for growth? Is that the direction, to provide more points for growth, to give districts more points for growth, or is the direction just to strike a balance? And the reason I'm asking that question is I know we're talking a lot about all the numbers, but I'm just thinking about growth for individual children, which I know that we do the alphabet process here, but I guess if you could give us some context around what that means. Because I do agree with my colleague when I looked at the way that we're calculating, it is very apparent that growth does need more some type of points or metrics to it, because you have a lot of schools, which I would agree, when I look at our system, that have these high alphabets, but when you look at growth per child,
There are like 16 schools that are in F in the state for growth. 16. We have over 1,000 schools in the state. I don't know that anyone could stand up and defend that that is true, that we only have 16 schools that are growing kids out of math. So step one is making sure that we are measuring it correctly, because there are some schools that are benefiting significantly from growth, that when we finish and get a more accurate measure, they might not benefit so much. They might be getting an 87 for growth, and their achievement might be a 50, and they might not be growing kids. And that 87 at 25% is increasing their SPS by many, many points, right? That might not happen anymore. So for some people, the weight of growth will improve their score, and for some people, the weight of growth will decrease their score. But the most important thing to us is an accurate representation of the work being done with each young person. And part of that work is determining if you have a student who's at approaching basic and you move them X number of scale score points, should you still receive an F in your calculation for that student? I think that that's what we need to grapple with, and then figure out the percentages later. Because part of the answer to that question is going to be, what are the weights, what are the percentages, or do you adjust it in the achievement part? All of those are things to discuss and think through. Does that sort of answer your question? Feel free to follow up and push me. I'm happy.
I mean, I'm a little biased in my beliefs, so I just want to put that out there. So,
Me too.
I'm all about growth over these other things. I just think that, you know, we need to be looking at children growth, because we all know they all start at different starting points. So I'm just trying to figure out, as we look at the formula, even for us at EBR, is how does growth become more of a measurement? Whether our schools are, because I look at our college schools, right, whether it's traditional, charter, whatever their label is, and I see variance between schools that have lower grades, but when you look at their growth scores, they're very high, but it does not reflect based on the current calculation. So when you talked about like Chicago and the other districts having a little bit of experience being in other parts of the country, I just want to know, have the department been able to engage with others that have some form of metrics where they've been able to figure out what the growth numbering is? But I would assume with Dr. Brumley, I'm sure you've done that already, but I just want to influence us that this is not a new thing, but there are places across the country that have kind of figured it out just a little bit. But if you guys are already talking about that, it'd be great to do that. But I know for us, if we don't have a clear growth approach, and I don't think it matters whether you're, you know, metropolitan, rural, or anything, it becomes a hard sell because our communities look at those alphabets as judges of whether you're doing well or not doing well, and I don't think that's always the best indicator.
Yeah, and I think that before we can increase that weight, we need to make sure that it's the right measure. That's step one, and step two is how much does it increase, and what does that school that, yes?
Sorry, just one more question. Is there any consideration that if you decide to move towards this direction, whatever that decision is, and there's a decision that by next year that we want to move this, is there any possibility that maybe we can pilot some of this in a few schools before going full scale across the state?
We could discuss that with the work group. I also would say that when there are changes to the accountability formula, we have to provide both scores for the first year. So you will have some reliable measure whenever it does go into effect of what would it have been had the formula not changed, and what is it under the new formula. So there's always transition built in.
Any other comments from superintendents? We have no public comment cards completed for this agenda item at this time. We do have a motion and a second to receive. All in favor, aye? Aye. Those opposed, nay?
Thank you.
Thank you,
Agenda item 5.1, consideration of revisions to bulletins regarding early literacy in response to education legislation of the 2021 regular legislative session. Do I have a motion to receive? I move. Moved by Superintendent Villiers. Second by Superintendent Joseph. Superintendent Brumley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Want to open up just by expressing again gratitude for everyone's work around literacy. You know, we have tried to scream from the rooftops the last couple of years the crisis that we have in terms of literacy in our state that has existed for some time. We believe that some of our movements, both legislatively but also through practice, hold promise to getting students where they need and deserve to be. And I just want to acknowledge that as I've walked into many of your schools or had conversations with you or your leaders or your teachers, some of the shifts that you've even made during your school day. One of the things I commonly say is, if your school day is organized today the same way it was organized 5 years ago, I would argue you're not being responsive to the needs of your kids. And two of the primary areas where I think that really matters is, one, do you have opportunities for your teachers to get together with a teacher leader in a group weekly and talk about student data and make inferences and think about how to be on top of the game for the next week to deliver for kids. And then the second place is you have a schedule developed where you have opportunities for either high dosage tutoring or intervention or extension. And I just feel like, for what it's worth, if you're not doing those things, then you probably have opportunities to be more responsive. And happy to talk with anyone about that beyond this conversation. You all know I care deeply about those things. But at this point, Dr. Chatson, I think, is going to come up and make a presentation just on some of the literacy policy shifts that we are making as a result of legislation from the last session.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
I would like to begin, before we dive into the proposed policy revisions, by just letting you all know that the Early Literacy Commission met last week and endorsed these policy revisions and additions. And I'd like to publicly thank Superintendent Joffrion and Superintendent Ortling, who are both on that Early Literacy Commission. They not only serve on the Early Literacy Commission, they never miss a meeting. They are also extremely participative, and I think really do a great job of representing superintendents and giving us that voice. And so they had some really great feedback last week. So I just wanted to start by thanking them. So I would also be remiss if I did not begin by saying that this is a large chunk of policy. It's a lot of policy. It is a big ask on systems to implement these literacy improvements. As Dr. Brumley pointed out, a lot of this is already taking place. You all are already engaging deeply in this work around literacy improvement in your systems. We already see the fruits of that labor across our state. And so this is just a way that codifies what was passed during the regular legislative session last spring, and now it codifies it in BESI policy. And so we know that the urgency is there to do this work. We know that less than half of our kindergarten through third grade students are entering the school year reading on grade level. So we know the urgency is there to implement this policy and do this work. Thank you. And so the first piece of policy includes a new section in Bulletin 741, the Handbook for School Administrators, that I know you are all very familiar with. It lists the requirements from Act 108 around professional development for teachers and leaders and places them into Section 509 under Chapter 5, Personnel of Bulletin 741. Act 108 defines who should be included in the training and how the training is selected. It gives oversight of vendor quality to the Department of Education, but provides autonomy to school systems in selecting a vendor. It requires school systems to report to the department, and the department in turn to post in school profiles. Number 4 of this section is also important to note for you all. It includes a waiver process if any school system would like to have a vendor approved outside of the vendor guide. We've had several school systems already reach out to us who have been engaging in work around literacy and who have requested this. We will use a waiver process to ensure comparable training is approved to those vendors who were selected for the vendor guide. And as I know you all are aware, that vendor guide was released back in the fall. Most of our systems at this point have selected vendors, and if you have not begun your training, you have plans to begin your training really soon. I know probably the last wave of people are really starting this summer, which is great. So that vendor guide was released. You all have made your decision around what vendor to use out of those 4 in the vendor guide. We'll also be opening that waiver process. We're looking to do that pending Bessie approval of this policy. We would release that waiver process at the end of March for anyone who is already using a vendor outside of the vendor guide. The next bulletin revision is the Bulletin 1566, which we more familiarly call Pupil Progression Policies and Procedures. From this bulletin, we know that the Pupil Progression template is created, and you all use that template to drive your local policies and procedures around how students progress from grade level to grade level. And so the additions to Bulletin 1566 are from Act 438. They include parent reporting, supports that include supports for at home and school, and letting parents know about their child's progress toward literacy. That's something that we've heard a lot of stakeholder feedback about, really making sure that parents are well informed in adequate timing throughout the year about their child's progress towards literacy. So that's also in Bulletin 1566. Another addition to Bulletin 1566 is for individual student literacy plans for 3rd grade students scoring below basic on LEAP ELA. This is mirrored from those 4th and 8th grade IEPs. And so this would be for students scoring below basic at the end of 3rd grade ELA LEAP to have a student-specific plan for literacy. That plan might include a decision at the local level to retain that 3rd grader in 3rd grade, or it might include the decision for that student to matriculate into the 4th grade with that individual reading plan to make sure that they're provided the supports that they need to be successful in the 4th grade. We know that's when a lot of those foundational reading skills are shifting into the 4th grade, and so we really are encouraging specific attention to those students who need it the most. But we want that local decision making. We want you all as system leaders, school leaders, and teachers to be able to make those decisions around those 3rd grade students. And if the decision best for the child is for them to have another year in 3rd grade or to move forward with a specific plan to make sure that they're getting what they need to be successful. The next bulletin that is proposed for updates is Bulletin 996, and this is standards for approval of teacher and/or educator leader preparation programs. And so from the beginning of our stakeholder engagement around literacy, we've talked a lot about the importance of ensuring our teacher preparation candidates are best prepared for the classroom. It's really important because we know that effective instruction is what will actually have the greatest impact on literacy achievement. We know there's no magic wand or silver bullet for solving for improved literacy outcomes. Our teachers are the ones engaging in this work every day with our students, so we need to make sure that they are best prepared to deliver literacy instruction. So the proposed bulletin revision to 996 comes from Act 438, and it calls for those 9 credit hours around literacy that already exist in both traditional and alternate teacher preparation programs to be very focused now on foundational literacy skills. And it also includes how to differentiate instruction for all students, including our students with dyslexia. And so those are the proposed bulletin revisions to Bulletin 996. And similarly, Bulletin 746 deals with the Louisiana standards for state certification of school personnel. So this is our certification bulletin. And Act 438, again, it asks for Bessie to update policy and include teacher competencies around literacy. So Bulletin 746 is going to include the competencies that teacher candidates need to demonstrate in their teacher preparation programs. So we, as a department, engaged with a work group both people from school systems and some of our folks from higher ed to develop these competencies that systematically and explicitly address the foundational literacy skills throughout a teacher candidate's coursework. These are all of the proposed policy revisions in this literacy policy package that Bessie, it will be brought to March Bessie in 2 weeks. And so I just wanted to acknowledge what is not in this current literacy policy package. 2 things to note. One is some proposed updates to Praxis. And so as I know you all are aware, changes to Praxis requirements for certification are very complicated and really take a really thorough amount of research and study and engagement. And so that is something that we're working on, but it's not included in this policy package. We'll probably see some updates in the months to come and another iteration of policy revisions around some Praxis changes, making sure that what we are testing in Praxis adequately measures a teacher preparation candidate's knowledge of foundational literacy skills. So that piece is to come. Another piece that is to come, I know Mr. Lambert just spoke with you all about accountability. We know that there is the K-2 accountability component, and there's also the literacy screener. I know everyone is aware that we've been engaged in an RFP process for a single literacy screener. We did release the information on our January system leader call that for next year, at the beginning of the year, we do want everyone to continue choosing from that list of 4 screeners. We are still engaging in that RFP process. We will not be down to that single screener by next fall, but we are hopeful for the fall after that. And so again, those are changes that we can expect to see in policy over the next few months and the next year as we continue to engage in this literacy work.
Gentlemen, am I correct in saying that the intent of this agenda item is to align this policy with Act 108 and Act 438?
Yes.
Any questions or comments from council members? Dr. Wilson?
First of all, I want to thank Dr. Chasson for the work that she's done, leading that commission, the work that you've done here. One thing that we had talked about during some of those discussions in Bulletin 996 regarding behavior management and trauma-informed principles. I see that it was separated from one section, but it's still listed under section 2. It's still going to be listed as both because we talked about leaving the literacy part separate and separating it. So could you just kind of maybe explain the rationale behind still keeping it in both?
It is still included in both because that is where and how it is included in the legislation.
Any other questions or comments from council members?
Literacy screener, sorry about that. The literacy screener, how soon will you guys come down to choosing one?
Yeah, so we're in the final stages of the RFP process. We then have contract negotiations, which takes a little while. And so I am hopeful by the summer we will be able to let you all know who that single screener is. And then that gives us next year to really begin some training. We know that implementing a new assessment at any level is a big lift for systems. So we want to make sure there's adequate time for communication, for training for district test coordinators, for school test coordinators, for the teachers themselves to administer. So we want to make sure that we have that runway of next year.
And again, if there are any members of the public who'd like to make comments, please fill out the comment cards. Superintendent Jenkins.
Yes, you mentioned something that's near and dear to my heart, Praxis. All right. So I know that's something that you haven't engaged in yet, but when you start having that conversation, I would love to be a part of that conversation. Definitely, I believe that we need to look at how Praxis is utilized at the collegiate level. I believe, doesn't mean it's the truth, it's just what I believe, that it's preventing a lot of potential candidates from getting into the College of Education. I think we need to also look at the possibility of being aligned geographically, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi. Louisiana has a very high standard. Not saying that the high standard is a bad thing, but it is preventing a lot of people from getting out of the College of Education or going into other majors. So I definitely would be interested in having that conversation regarding practice examination, how it can be revamped if possible, or what adjustments we can make. Again, we have a major teacher shortage. That's nothing that everyone's dealing with in this room and throughout the country. And so we just need to be able to look at how we can have more candidates in education, so it can definitely get more people engaged in education.
Superintendent Ross.
Yeah, Dr. Jason, just quick, can you share just a couple of those minimal requirements that we're talking about, or at least new, in terms of the teacher prep program? So I'm not asking that question.
Are you talking about the competencies in 730?
Yeah. Just a couple of, coursework, the coursework requirements, I think, the biggest is really, yes. Maybe I should just wait and ask Dr. Joe Frion, and since they've been there. I know it's hard for me to sit here just long and not say anything, right?
Yeah, those competencies are.
They don't have to be real deep.
No, they're located in Bulletin 746. So it's basically making sure that teachers understand. Right now, reading, those 9 hours of reading courses are required for our teacher preparation candidates. But anyone who has been through teacher preparation programs knows that what is delivered during those 9 hours is quite different. So it might be more heavy on, reading comprehension, and a lot of times maybe it stays there. And this calls out that teachers are explicitly learning more about the science of reading and about those foundational literacy skills. So they're learning more about phonics and phonemic awareness and fluency. So they're really digging much deeper into those foundational literacy skills, and that is being required here, whereas before there were some more broad parameters.
When a program is approved by the DESE to offer a certification, they have to sign off that they are meeting the competencies and are addressing and teaching those things. So it's really about their program being approved by the board to certify once this candidate finishes.
Questions or comments by Superintendent Johnson?
I think it's important that this group realizes that while we will have to implement these literacy foundational trainings over the next couple of years, the goal is that the graduates will leave their College of Education prepared, and then ultimately we will no longer have to provide that additional training. And so I think that the state has done an outstanding job in the work that they've done under Dr. Brumley and Dr. Chasson, really bringing together some of the most powerful literacy leaders from across the state in so many different agencies and councils. And it has definitely been great work that Dr. Chasson has led.
Any other questions or comments from council members?
And just piggybacking on what you just said, and we've had some discussions at DESE that this science of reading mandate, which requires our teachers to do 54, 55 hours of training, is going to hopefully go away, because I know y'all are having discussions hopefully with the Board of Regents and the teacher prep programs at the colleges and universities, as well as mandating it in all of the alternative teacher preparation programs, that candidates cannot graduate without those competencies. So that this training would be in a course that they're taking in the college or university, or in our own teacher prep programs, alternative prep programs that we have. So the quicker that can get implemented at the college level on these teacher prep levels, the faster, then we will not have to make our teachers continually go through this beyond the first couple of years.
Any other questions or comments by council members?
And this is an added expense for districts, or all of this is covered by the department?
So the science of reading training is, it is something that we are using our ESSER set-aside funds for. And so that is something through the Super App process, you all have been able to tell us how many teachers and leaders are undergoing the training so that we are able to reimburse those funds for the training.
Any other questions or comments?
Mr. Jones, would acknowledge that Teacher Leader Summit, one of the priority areas for sessions will be literacy. And also acknowledging that we have set aside the first day of Teacher Leader Summit, a specific skinny session just for system leaders. And so we're hopeful that everyone can attend that. And we're also hopeful that by all means possible, you can encourage people in your district to register for Summit. Because once again, like last year, we're face-to-face, and we had a great experience last year with a smaller number, but we're expanding those numbers for this year, so hopefully you can encourage your teams within your system to register.
We have no public comments at this time. There is a motion on the floor to receive by Superintendent DeVilliers, second by Superintendent Joseph.
I'd like to make a substitute motion that we endorse the revisions as discussed here in the bulletin.
I'll second that motion.
Substitute motion to receive and endorse made by Superintendent Corley, second by Superintendent Pyle. All in favor, aye?
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Agenda item 5.2, consideration of revisions to bulletins regarding learning pods in response to legislation of the 2021 regular legislative session. We have a motion to receive. Motion to receive by Superintendent Watts. We have a second. Second by Superintendent Joseph. Superintendent Crum.
Yes, sir. So during the last legislative session, a bill passed, became law to establish learning pods throughout the state of Louisiana. It could be argued that you already have the ability to do that. However, it certainly does clarify your ability to establish learning pods within your systems. And so at one of our last Bessie meetings, the members of our board asked us to go ahead and develop policy so that they could consider that policy around learning pods. And so we've been working as an agency over the last month and a half, essentially, to try to develop that policy. And so Dr. Chasson is going to present that to you today.
As Dr. Brumley mentioned, Act 400 of the 2021 legislative session authorized public school governing authorities to establish learning pods. So that would be groups of 10 students for the purposes of small group instruction that can happen across grade levels and either at a physical school site or virtually. This was one of many approaches we know that was taken during the COVID-19 pandemic to help support students across the country. And as Dr. Brumley mentioned, at the December Bessie meeting, we, as a department, were asked to provide recommendations for revisions to Bulletin 741 regarding learning pods. And in our follow-up, we've also identified some opportunities for revisions in Bulletin 126 to ensure that there is language for charter schools as well. So we know that learning pods are in their early stages of implementation. And so we have produced proposed policy, but also some guidance that I'll share a snapshot with you all today so that we can help to provide more support and clarity. So the first set of policy revisions related to learning pods would occur in Bulletin 741, and it would fall under two broad buckets. The first of which is a revision to Section 905 to include learning pods and an exception to the rule for elementary school teachers, which would then allow elementary school teachers assigned to learning pods, like elementary school teachers who teach electives, to teach more than 2 grade levels in a combined group in that learning pod setting. The second set of revisions creates a new chapter in Bulletin 741, which is Chapter 37, that provides language that aligns with Act 400 directly, and it sets 10 as the minimum number of students required to create a learning pod, outlining and ensuring that student placement aligns with existing state and federal statutes, as well as Bessie policy, such as mandates in IDEA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Additionally, we're also recommending revisions to Bulletin 126 to ensure that there is parallel policy for charter schools as well. The proposed revision to Bulletin 126 would include the provision of learning pods as a material amendment for BESI authorized charter schools. This would mean that BESI would approve the use of learning pods in charter schools. So once again, we know that learning pods are relatively new in their implementation, and they're one of the many innovations that have emerged during the pandemic. And so it's important to us that we're able to provide some guidance. So we do have a guidance document that will be released pending BESI approval of these policy proposals. And so we do anticipate releasing that guidance on more topics about how to select student groupings, how to support students with disabilities, supporting English language learners, instructional planning, teacher certification and evaluation, and best practices for teaching in these environments. So we are very interested in continuing to develop out any guidance that is needed for systems who choose to implement learning pods in their communities.
Any questions or comments from council members pertaining to this agenda item? And again, if any members of the public would like to make comments, please complete a card.
So learning pods can occur at whatever place, location, time that we set, just providing additional support for kids who need it because of learning gaps.
Yes, that is up to the LEA.
Any other questions or comments from council members? Superintendent Johnson?
I do have just a couple of concerns about the learning pods, in that it does afford some charter organizations the ability to recruit students and place them in a charter school in a learning pod that does not exist in the locale of the students. For instance, there are students who can participate in a learning pod at the Iberville Charter School, but they reside in East Baton Rouge Parish. And this is being done in a couple of instances to pad school performance scores. They are obviously recruiting high-performing students, and so I just wanted to publicly state that I do have some concerns about the ability that these pods are going to provide to assist charter schools with that we cannot certainly recruit students from other school districts, but they will have that ability and have their school performance scores.
Questions or comments from any other superintendents?
So are these learning pods like beyond just groups of kids? Is this a
type, you're mentioning charter. A type 1 charter would only be allowed to have those pods, as I appreciate, within the set boundaries set forth in that type 1 process. So if it's within the parish, they would not be able to go to another parish and add students in a learning pod if they're authorized, say, as a type 1. Type 2 already potentially has a broader scope of service. And so that is one of the reasons why in the policy we've added that there would be a material amendment. So if you're going to operate the learning pods, then you would need to come forward to BESI, which is the authorizer, and request a material amendment to do so.
Questions or comments from council members? We have a motion and a second to receive. All in favor, aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Our next agenda item, 5.3, consideration of an update report regarding Louisiana revised statute 17:4035.1 pertaining to the intra-district student transfer BESI appeals process. Do I have a motion to receive? Motion to receive by Superintendent Javia. Second. Second by Superintendent Corley. At this time, Superintendent Brumlett.
Ms. Davis, as Executive Director, will make this presentation.
Yes. In the 2021 legislative session, it was a law was approved, 17403.35.1, to allow parents who have children in a D or an F school to request a transfer to an A, B, or C school, pending that it does not violate any court competent jurisdiction, and then pending that it would not exceed capacity. If the transfer is denied by the district, then they can appeal to Bessie. This is the, subsequently, this was what was the meat of it, was that they could appeal to Bessie for an appeal for that student to be transferred. That's what the law states. In December 2021, Bessie approved this policy because the law mandated that this happen. And what the policy basically says is, what the law says, is that if a student is denied the transfer, they can complete a transfer request appeal form that Bessie has developed, attach a copy of the denial letter from the LEA, return the form to Bessie no later than May 15th. The request will be honored 90 days after acknowledgement of the receipt, hopefully to be handled at the June meetings of Bessie. If Bessie determines, and this is also in the law, that the transfer request denial is not in compliance with the school district's policy regarding these requests, Bessie can ship it back to the school district to reconsider this request. And then finally, Bessie shall not approve the transfer request that would exceed the enrollment capacity of the school. Here's what should be happening in your districts right now, or what should have happened regarding this statute so far. Each LEA is required to adopt a policy governing student transfers, which shall be posted to the school governing authority's website no later than January 1st, 2022, and reported to the State Department of Education no later than January 30th, 2022. And that should be reported, should be reported to the Office of School System Relations within the department. And we can get you an email contact if you don't already have that. What your policies should include in your district are the following. The process for the parents to submit these student transfer requests, the transfer request period dates and deadlines, which as was on a previous slide, it's to begin in March annually, March 1st through, what did I say, the end of the month. Yeah, March 20th. Then also, the transfer request needs to be denied in writing so that when they come to Bessie, they will have actual confirmation that they were denied this transfer. The page of the Department of Education's website that contains the school performance data should be posted, as well as your definition of capacity for each school. A point to be made here is that LEAs are not required to provide transportation to students enrolled in public schools outside of the system, or if providing such transportation will result in additional costs to the system. Other LEA responsibilities once you have your policy in place. All students and parents who attend DNF, students who attend DNF schools, they should be notified that their school has received a DNF letter grade, excuse me. They should be notified of the provisions of this section, and they should be notified of the schools in your district that do have an A, B, or C performance score. One of the things when we brought this policy to the board in December, they asked that I bring a parent document, guidance document, which I did do, and I have copies here if anybody needs it, to the January meeting. When I brought it to the January meeting, several board members had questions about what capacity really is and what it could be, beyond that of the fire marshal regulations of the numbers of individuals in the building. And I know there are other things that go into capacity. Ms. Boucher has told me several things in the past about your Title I requirements, which you set maybe some limits on that and that kind of thing. And so the board directed me to come back with a report in March to give them more information on this idea of capacity. So what I would like to do is work with some superintendents to maybe come up with a guidance document for Bessie members to use when they're making these decisions on these appeals, so that they have information about what could possibly go into capacity beyond what you posted on your websites, because as you saw earlier, if the board determines that your policy wasn't followed, we can automatically ship that back. So we need to know what that is, number one, and it needs to make sense. So if that is possible, I would like to be able to do that. And then also, I didn't know if y'all wanted to discuss this requirement, if you're aware of it, any questions you might have.
Thank you for sharing that information, Ms. Davis. And I would like to lead out with that question. How many council members were aware of this revised statute?
Yeah.
You were aware?
Yeah.
Have you made changes to your board policy? Ms. Davis and I had conversations about this. If I'm not mistaken, it would probably be under file JB, CD, student transfers and withdrawals. Some of us use forethought consultants, some of us use other entities to revise our policies. My policy was last revised in March of 2018. So we are appreciative of being made aware of this revised statute so that we can make the very good faith effort to comply.
Yeah, if you use forethought, they did send out some revised policies, and I think many of us adopted them this past fall. But I'd like to point out a couple of things, and this is just me talking as an individual superintendent, not as a Bessie member here at this point. This piece of legislation, through the efforts of our association and LSBA, we got it changed to only apply for this year. And I'm sure there'll be a run on it again, maybe in a session. We got it changed to only apply to intra-district student transfers. So this policy does not apply to any student coming from outside of your district to come into your district. We have another, we also have a policy for those students who are in DNF schools in maybe a neighboring district, and they come apply to come in. That still is in effect. This provision added to it is only for kids within your own district. So just like the ESSA stuff, you have to tell your parents if they're in a DRF school that they have the possibility of moving to an ABUC school within your own district. Now the definition of capacity, and again, we looked at it in my district, and such, and many of y'all did. It has, in my opinion, very little to do with building capacity. Even if you have an extra classroom sitting in a building, maybe unoccupied, that you use for something else. The capacity is an extensive definition. You have to take into consideration, there are some schools that you have at URI or CIR schools that you purposefully do student-pupil-teacher ratios. There are some schools you might staff at 20 to 1, or some schools you might staff at 15 to 1 if they're a particular type school. Some have special needs kids, some have English language learners, so your capacity is different. We look at it as when we staff a school, they may not be staffed at the same ratio. Then because we are a district with attendance zones, we also have to leave room for any kid who transfers into your district. For example, Henderson is sitting here, and because he's my good friend and buddy, so I pick on him because all Charlie is, that he's a St. Bernard guy, sorry.
That's right.
But, he may have an enrollment cap at one of his charter schools, and they don't go beyond the enrollment cap. They go up to the enrollment cap and no more. But in our districts, any family that moves into the attendance zone, we have to take. We can't say, I'm sorry, we're at our cap in second grade at this school, so we're not going to take you in second grade. We'll put you in a different school. No, we have to put you in your attendance zone. So our policy defines capacity when we set our pupil-teacher ratios that we believe it may be at 90% of capacity or 80% of capacity is set for pupil-teacher ratios to allow, because we have a very transient student body, very transient parish. So we allow for some of that. So when we're setting a definition of capacity, we take a lot into account, I'm sure as many of you do. And as the law, as I read it, right now, says that when the appeal comes to best, and it's written in the law, it's looking at capacity as defined by the school system, not as defined by the State Department of Education or as defined by the Betsy Board or whatever. So that's why I'm talking as a superintendent here, not as a member of the Betsy Board, because I don't know where that will necessarily lead. But I think these are things that when we look to revise the policies or to implement it, that the definition of capacity could be very different as it goes from school system to school system, depending upon the individual needs or circumstances of a particular school system or school within your system. So that's just my thoughts.
Thank you, Superintendent Boccia. Any other questions or comments from council members?
If anyone wants to help me out, you're my contact.
So we do have a motion to receive along with a second. All in favor, aye? Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Agenda item 5.4, consideration of an update report regarding the social studies standards review process. I have a motion to receive. Motion by Superintendent Laviolette. Second. Second by Superintendent Lewis. Superintendent Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I would begin by just indicating that this is a process that began in December of 2020. And so it has often felt like an impossible task, but it has always felt like a worthy task. And I think that we are at a place today, after over a year, that we are pleased to be able to make a set of recommended standards to our board that we feel like adhere to the initial desires when we began in December of 2020. When we think back, some of the things that we wanted to accommodate and accomplish, we wanted to fix the broken coherency in terms of progression of courses, so that students over their K-12 experience learn history in a chronological way. That was one thing that was really important. Next is adding rigor to the standards, and we've taken that even to the next level of not just rigor but specificity, which we believe gives our teachers very clear guidance on those events, individuals, actions over the course of history and in economics and in civics and places in geography. So rigor was important. Our students right now in the state of Louisiana are 24% proficient in social studies. So when we talk about literacy rates and math rates, those are in the 40s. Social studies is 24%. I believe because we have a broken system of coherency across the grades. I believe because we don't have rigor and we don't have specificity. And then that leads me to the third bullet, which was making sure that we were incorporating the experiences of all Americans and making sure that multiple historical perspectives were included. Now, doing all that takes me back to my initial point of it has often, over a year plus, felt impossible, but has always felt like a worthy cause. So the process began in December 2020. A couple of different work groups were established. A steering group was established. That work was a challenging work because it was in the middle of COVID. Many of those meetings were held over Zoom. Those individuals did a really good job of giving us a foundation for which to work and a foundation for us to go out to public comment. And we did that. And so we went out to public comment with the draft set of standards in, I believe, October of 2021. Our board asked us to expand that public comment period. We did that. Our board asked us to take into account the public comment, utilize the public comment, and come back with a set of standards based on all this process. And that was a unanimous decision from our board to ask us to do that. 1,500 public comments last year around that draft, and that public comment prompted revisions that we have since made. Over a couple of months at the agency, looking at a number of other states, looking at best practices, going back to those initial ideals that we felt were important, we put out several weeks back a new draft of standards, and we decided to go ahead and put those out as well for public comment. And I believe that closed Tuesday night at midnight. And I want to say we had I don't know if it was north or south of, but we had around 400 public comments. And so those public comments, we were live tracking over the last several weeks and making adjustments to minor adjustments to the standards through that process, and also having conversations with individuals, not just in that portal, about what and how they felt about those standards. And so we are at a point today where not only are we not only in a place where we had the draft available several weeks ago, but we have made some shifts based on public comment even over the last few weeks that we'll tell you about. And we just want to share this information with you because our goal is for this to go to our Betsy in March with the hopes of approval in advance, certainly of the legislative session that's coming up, but also because we want to build in a learning year that kicks off at Teacher Leader Summit around these standards so that individuals can come to those sessions, go back to their local systems and begin a process. And then we have a full year where we can help develop resources to support the implementation when that begins in 23-24. You all know whenever we think about our social studies standards now, we have a lack of resources to support those. And so what has happened over time is you've adopted, maybe you've adopted some curriculum, but what I see frequently are just teachers who've tried to build their own stuff here and there to make something work because that high-level curriculum has not been necessarily made available across the state. I believe we're going to have publishers that want to write to these standards. And I think that will be a good thing for our kids if we can put high-quality resources in front of them. So that's just like an opening of where we are. I don't know if Dr. Chasson is in the room, who is probably going to come up once again and walk through a very short presentation on this. We're certainly not going through 60 pages of standards today, but we have that in front of you, and certainly it's been a public document for several weeks.
This will be very brief, as Dr. Brumley has delivered most of the slides already in his opening, so thank you for that, Dr. Brumley. So just to put a few dates in front of you all, Just like Dr. Brumley already talked through, reviewing the timeline today, we started back in December of 2020 on this quest for new social studies standards. Really trying to abide by that timeline. We were overdue to update and revise our standards, and so kicked off that process over a year ago now, and are happy to say that in March we are bringing this to the March BESI meeting. So just a high-level overview addressing some areas of public concern. So along with those public comments that we received and additional considerations from conversations with stakeholders across the state, there were some overall things that were shifted in this new version, draft version of the standards. So the first is overly broad standards made expectations unclear for students and were potentially confusing to our educators and the public at large. So that shift was made for the standards to become more specific. Also, we had a lot of public comment about grade 3 in particular, saying that grade 3 did not devote enough time to state and national history, and it contained world history. So we had a lot of public feedback that grade 3 world history could potentially cause some difficulties with that content being potentially too difficult for third graders. And so the grade 2 course content was extended into third grade, and that shift was made to condense world history into grades 4 and 5. We also had a lot of comment about high school U.S. history. It previously was missing the American Revolution, the nation's founding, and fundamental primary source documents. And so the dates of coverage for U.S. history were expanded with more concrete references to founding documents and critical primary sources spanning from 1785 to 2008. So as Dr. Brumley said, the refined draft and public comment was received in February, and it will be presented to BESI at the Academic Goals Instructional Improvement Committee on March 8th. And so I know what is of interest to you all, to this group specifically, is the timeline moving forward. So just to put this all out in front of you, next year we do have plans for a full learning year. As Dr. Brumley said, kicking off at our Teacher Leaders Summit, our team is prepared to really present some robust sessions to our educators who attend Summit this year around these new social studies standards. And we would there provide resources and professional development. We would also open our instructional materials review process to call for publishers to create and submit aligned materials to these new standards. I know we've also heard a lot of concerns from educators across the state about our social studies assessment and when that alignment will take place. So you see here in spring of 2023 would be the final LEAP 2025 social studies assessment. The final administration would take place next spring. And in 2023, 2024, we would see the revised standards implemented in classrooms. And that new social studies assessment field testing would take place in the 23-24 school year. And by 24-25, we would have a new operational grades 3 through 8 and high school civics assessment aligned to these new standards. So you see the runway between the standards, that learning year, implementation, and then a new assessment.
Any questions or comments from council members?
Mr. Jones, if I could just say, I just want to thank Dr. Brumley, Dr. Jason, and the entire department. My stakeholders have been actively engaged in this entire process, and the department went out of their way, I'll just say that loudly, the department went out of their way to hear their concerns, address myths, address, misinformation, whatever it might have been. The department bent over backwards to make sure that their concerns were heard, that they were very transparent, everything was very clear, concise. So I just want to thank Dr. Brumley and the entire department for doing their due diligence in a very, very difficult time, to put it mildly. So I just want to thank them for all their work and efforts.
Any other questions or comments from council members?
Well, I already see a problem with this. It's on for grade 1. When you talk about the cuisine, obviously where you added crab cakes, I have a big problem with that. You had a gumbo etouffee, oh, crab cakes included.
Duly noted. Mr. Jones, once everybody's done, I'd like to make a substitute motion.
Any other questions or comments?
Just real quick, when we're looking forward to future assessments, that's still considering the new assessments that we're piloting currently? Like how is that, as far as the integration between ELA and social studies, is that been considered?
So yes, that has been considered. You're talking specifically about our innovative assessment pilot. And so the innovative assessment pilot is for those lower grade levels, and we see that that has parted from social studies in the past year and has become only ELA and not social studies. So this will be a brand new assessment for social studies based on these new standards.
So the direction of the department is still to separate the two and not necessarily join?
Yes.
So no more humanities, and you're switching from U.S. history to the civics?
Yeah, that was the switch from U.S. history to civics was something that we had recommended we actually brought that through SAC and Accountability Commission, recommended that to Bessie. The idea was that we would get all of our EOCs, LEAP 2025s, completed by like 9th and 10th grade year, because most systems do civics in the 10th grade and U.S. history in 11th, through kind of what we heard. And then that frees up 11th and 12th grade for AP, dual enrollment, all those types of things, and they've already taken care of those graduation requirement courses. Yep.
Any other questions or comments?
Just one additional comment. This is our question really, and I want to echo Superintendent Javia's congratulatory remarks, and I really appreciate the thoughtfulness, the comprehensive nature in which the standards review process played out, especially during these times. But just wanted, Dr. Brummer, you mentioned publishers coming to the table, and that is, I think, all of our hope and wish. And we know that social studies teachers have been very creative for some time. I thank the department for standing in a gap to a certain degree. I know scope and sequences for many years now. But do you have any, other than hoping they do, have you had any discussion with publishers around creating curriculum for these standards?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be appropriate to go into those details, but yes, we have heard from publishers that have been tracking this process that feel that these standards potentially are worthy of them writing to, because they feel that again, shouldn't put words in their mouth, but there's potential that sets of standards that are of quality like this could be adopted in other places, and so they could take to a larger scale. So I think we're more than hopeful about that.
Great, thank you.
If there are public comments, please be sure to complete a card. Any other questions or comments from council members? At this time, there are no public comment cards completed. We do have a motion and a second on the floor by Superintendent Lauderdale. Superintendent Lewis.
Mr. Jones, I'd just like to make a substitute motion that we receive and affirm the proposal brought to us today.
We have a substitute motion to receive and endorse by Superintendent Jolly. Second by Superintendent Watts. That's the motion that we'll be voting on. All in favor, aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carries. Motion to adjourn. Superintendent Powell.
A lot of seconds.
Yeah, you got a lot of seconds.